This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where's the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome, everybody. This is episode 78 of the Naked Mormonism podcast. This is the Serial Mormon History Podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Blankenagel. Today is Friday, November 24th, 2017. Hope you had a happy Thanksgiving, and thank you so much for joining me. Today is a special edition episode. We're finally diving into polygamy. The reason why is we're ramping up for the introduction of official polygamy prior to April of 1841 in Nauvoo. But before doing so, we have to set the historical stage to understand the world from which Mormon polygamy evolved. We begin with marriage from the dawn of historical time and skim across the top of major world religions throughout most of written history to finally arrive at the post-enlightenment Western world filled with small groups of free-love proto-hippies. This is part one of a multi-part series on Mormon polygamy. Human sexuality is a powerful force which drives or governs many of our actions. Sex is the sole mechanism by which our species persists and flourishes, and through a myriad of selective pressures, we've come to find ourselves living in a world where sex is primarily viewed through a religious lens. Until recently, it was strictly priests or some other religious leader who would approve of and officiate a marriage ceremony, usually interviewing the individuals to be married prior to performing the ceremony to give what those people saw as sound marriage advice and to determine whether or not said religious leader approved of the marriage pairing. In so many cultures throughout history, and even today, nobody enjoys marriage without the stamp of approval from a minister, a reverend, or a bishop. Today, we have secular celebrants. And the act of getting married amounts to nothing more than two people signing a secular document in front of a judge at a courthouse. Yet the grandiose ceremony with no real-world application still survives. Two people come together with each family on each side of the aisle. A priest or some qualified officiator makes a profound speech full of platitudes that don't actually help the couple in their day-to-day life, after which said officiator pronounces the people married and gives them permission to kiss, and then the crowd throws rice at the newlyweds, and somebody's uncle breaks a glass in a washcloth, and people get drunk and dance around, and, the ceremony's over. But all of that is just a show. It's a ceremony. What really matters is the secular document that they signed granting the people a marriage license, which determines them to be married. Everything else is a largely sectarian holdover from our earliest societies where these ceremonies were truly significant. If we think back to the tribal foundations of marriage ceremonies, they were crucial to making and keeping peace among different tribes of people. Picture the prototypical two warring tribes led by elder alpha warriors. They finally have enough of killing each other, and the two tribe leaders decide to wed their children and intermingle DNA in order to bind the two tribes together, signaling to the rest of both tribes that the other tribe are friendly and they can all intermarry and everybody can live happy lives without having to worry about the other tribe killing them. Now, this larger combined tribe, made up of the constituent two tribes, can find another smaller tribe and fight with them until they're either wiped out or until they come to an agreement and marry together more of the alpha male's children. and so on, and so on, and so forth, until tribes become large enough to conquer by sword or by marriage large swaths of land. These ceremonies were largely conducted by spiritual or religious leaders of the tribe, and they served an actual purpose in uniting clans and passing daughters off as property. Which brings us to another use for marriage: property exchange. You know, this great warrior, Bogran, go conquer our promised land uninhabited by those infidels. You can have your pick of my daughters for a wife if you succeed. Or, you know, it's something like two businessmen make a deal in buying or selling land or goods, and one of the guys might want to throw in a daughter to sweeten the deal and ensure a smooth transition of property. It all comes down to some way of intermingling DNA to express goodwill between two people or groups of people. One significant piece which cannot be ignored in this historical marriage formula is purity. The only way to ensure that a man's children were indeed his own was for him to marry a virgin woman. The male's virginity is rarely ever an issue, so the weight of staying pure usually falls to women. A woman's worth is determined by her purity. One man with 3 beautiful virgin daughters could be wealthier than a man with 10 beautiful non-virgin daughters for trade. It's how humans have commodified our most basic natural instinct to reproduce. And along with any commodity, the wealthiest tend to amass more of it than the less wealthy. A poor sharecropper needs one wife with 12 kids to work the fields, but the nobleman may have 5 houses, 3,000 acres, 15 wives, and 35 kids. That's just how society was structured in a world where women are property. It wouldn't be until the 20th century when the newfound craze of love marriages would begin making its way into American culture. Prior to that, it was a lucky convenience if love was present in a marriage, but it definitely wasn't a necessity. Often a love interest would develop between the two people in courtship, but the business aspect of the marriage would fall out and the marriage wouldn't go through. Sometimes love interests would develop between people who were never allowed to get married. In each and every one of these examples, it's been largely incumbent upon the established religion or spiritualism to ascribe specific value and restrictions on a person's sexuality. We have innate human instincts, which push us towards having a single partner and saving child rearing for that person. But religions have been able to apply words of value to sexuality and punishment for the unauthorized practice thereof. You're chaste and pure, or you're defiled and damned. Love and doting follow one, shame and exile follow the other. In much the same way sexuality has been successfully commodified, it's also been weaponized with the complicated emotions surrounding this basic human practice. Think about this on an individual level. If something sexually entices us, that's attractive, beautiful, sensual. But what about a specific sexual practice that we don't like? It's disgusting, it's perverse, it's sinful. All of those words we ascribe to deep human emotions of liking or disliking something when it comes to sexuality. And everybody is different. Most of us fall into a few simplistic categories we ascribe to what we like and dislike about sexuality. Most people fall into this cis-hetero category, but it's only been recently in broad American culture that we've been acknowledging the existence of sexuality outside of these societal norms. The gay rights movement has opened up avenues of discussion to all points on the sexuality spectrum to be defined and discussed in the open forum. What started as acknowledgement that some people don't like the other sex has evolved into more healthy discussions of what everybody likes and dislikes sexually. Transsexual people have a seat at the table where they never seemed to be a topic of discussion before. Queer people not defined by simple categories are taking back the word from being a pejorative slur. Bisexual people who refuse to follow only the cis-hetero side of their sexual identity are finding it easier to have conversations about who and what they find enticing. People with fetishes the mainstream considers weird live in online communities filled with pros sharing tips on how to tie up their partner without giving them rope burn. Some people can't even get off without putting themselves or their partners in situations which require safe words. Some people are genuinely attracted to only children and resort to predatory practices to get their fix because children can't legally consent. Some people are polypansexual, open to every kind of love from every kind of person, many of whom choose to live in these small communes of like-minded folk who spend every night in a different bed with different partners, shunning off the orthodoxy of the society around them. Today begins a multiple-part series breaking down the most notable, salacious, and attention-grabbing aspect of Mormonism and Mormon history: polygamy. Polygamy in Mormonism is something we've briefly discussed up to this point in our historical timeline, but it's a topic which has enjoyed an incredible breadth of scholarship and exposure over the history of the church. Now, personally, in toiling with how to present this without redoing what Lindsay Park did with Year of Polygamy or just reading an audio version of Todd Compton's book In Sacred Loneliness, I'm left with the task of conveying the importance and historical impact of polygamy in Mormonism without making it the primary focus of our overarching Nauvoo analysis. I'm going to lay out a roadmap of how these next few episodes will go. We're going to begin with defining some terms and discussing polyamorous or polygamous and wife-swapping cultures and societies in Europe and America, and really across the world, which led up to or possibly even influenced Mormonism. Then, we're going to dig into the subject of polygamy in Kirtland and Nauvoo, and skim over some of the Utah polygamy in the 19th century. After that, we're going to look at later iterations of how polygamy was practiced all through the 20th century, and get into the modern-day iterations, with a focus on various Mormon factions which broke from the Brighamite and reorganized orthodoxy. We're going to have interviews peppered throughout the episodes from people who with experiences in polygamy to try and, kind of spice things up and break up the monotony of just my voice talking. And more importantly, to bring some first-hand knowledge to the table. One quick word before we jump in. I'm going to stay as far away from ought as possible and just talk about what is. The primary issue with talking about polygamy and other forms of lifestyle and sexual preference choices is not asserting one specific lifestyle over the other as superior. That being said, inherent in many of these polygamous societies is a patriarchal power dynamic, which bears examination and scrutiny. Informed consent is a tough requirement to parse out of these societies, when entire lifestyles are structured around a few powerful men controlling subservient women and child slave laborers to keep the society afloat. We'll discuss these foundational aspects of common polygamous cultures when we get there. Also, one more quick addition. I have very little control over what the guests may say in the interviews, and their biases come into play given their experiences. But those experiences are valid, and what they say is based on those experiences. So, with all that said, please join me in this stroll through polygamy throughout human history. Let's start by defining a few loaded terms. These are going to be really useful in our examination of polygamy. Polygamy merely means many spouses, whereas monogamy is one spouse. While we think monogamous societies have been the norm because it's kind of the norm in most societies today, polygamy in some form has existed for much longer than we have written history, and it was often reserved for the wealthiest in structured societies. Polygyny is what we focus on primarily when it comes to Mormonism. Polygyny is specifically one man with multiple wives, while polyandry is one woman with multiple husbands. Polyamory is from the Greek meaning many love. Polyamory, as it is defined modernly, is the practice of intimate relationships with more than one partner, with the knowledge of all partners. It's been described as consensual, ethical, and responsible non-monogamy. But polyamory also is not polygamy. Polyamory does not mean marriage. Polygamy means the marriage. Now, aside from all of those terms, we have adultery or affairs, and those are just simply where one person in a committed monogamous relationship has extramarital relations with one or multiple people without the knowledge or consent of their spouse. Wife swapping is a term, and that's simply a colloquial term for swinging, or, two couples trading spouses. Spiritual wifery was a term used by Mormons and anti-Mormons as a pejorative for unauthorized polygyny. And polygyny, of course, is one man with multiple wives. With those terms defined, let's finally get into the history. Polygamy has been a part of most societies, dating before we have written history. The Code of Nauvoo, the oldest text we have for the establishment of a government, was written between 2100 and 2050 BCE, and it was in Sumerian. It was discovered in Mesopotamia on 2 stone tablets, which was translated in the mid-20th century. Now, nailing down government laws and ordinances, or even socially acceptable forms of marriage prior to this, is an exercise in futility, as only small fragments of tablets remain. We can rest assured that polygamy was not only seen as socially acceptable, but was the societal norm, especially for elites in society. From all we can tell, strict monogamy as the societal norm has only arisen in various sedentary agricultural cultures in relatively recent history. I'm going to read a few extracts from the Code of Nauvoo, which sound oddly similar to what survived in some of the laws included in the Torah. You can check the show notes for the entire 32 covenants that they list out in this secular document, but we're just going to read a few extracts that relate to marriage specifically. Number 4, if a slave marries a slave and that slave is set free, he does not leave the household. Number 5, if a slave marries a native, i.e. a free person, he or she is to hand the firstborn son over to his owner. If a man violates the right of another and deflowers the virgin wife of a young man, they shall kill that male. If the wife of a man followed after another man and slept with her, they shall slay that woman, but the male shall be set free. Patriarchal cultures. If a man proceeded by force and deflowered the virgin female slave of another man, that man must pay 5 shekels of silver. So that's the fine for raping a virgin female slave, 5 shekels of silver. If a man divorces his first-time wife, he shall pay her 1 mina of silver. If it is a former widow whom he divorces, he shall pay her a half mina of silver. If a man had slept with a widow without there having been any marriage contract, he need not pay any silver. And finally, number 25, if a man's slave woman, comparing herself to her mistress, speaks insolently to her, her mouth shall be scoured with 1 quart of salt. End quote. From this Code of Nauvoo, we can see a number of laws governing marriage, but it doesn't specify anything about monogamy versus polygamy. What does seem to arise is the fact that women were mere property, and having some property doesn't limit your ability to gain more of that property. It does have 2 provisions sanctioning divorce, so we can understand that marriage as an institution predates the text and was considered the status quo. Most people got married. However, given how the text reads in limiting the practice of adultery, i.e. killing the woman and setting the man free when said affair happens, it does express how vital to society marriage was. How else do you ensure that your children are actually yours? I'm asking that just of the men, of course, because these laws were written by men for men to govern a society dominated by men, which will actually be a bit of a recurring theme throughout most of what we discuss in relation to marriage and polygamy. The code does state that if a slave woman insolently compares herself to a man's mistress, that she'll be punished by scouring of the mouth with a quart of salt. Mistresses and concubines were just a part of the status quo. That was just a thing. Brothels just existed, and they weren't anathema to law. And slave women were also seemingly treated as sex toys by their masters. One thing worth pointing out, the Code of Nauvoo is a secular text. There are no provisions about religious practice or limitations of religious practice anywhere in the text. It was purely a piece issued for the governance of a polytheistic pagan society for the betterment of said society. Most of the other provisions that I didn't read just lay out the punishments for assaulting somebody or how land contracts are to be dealt with. You can check the show notes, like I said, for a link to the entire translation. If we zoom out to the history of world cultures and marriage practices, polygamy really was the societal norm, and today only about a quarter of cultures strictly prohibit polygamy. You'll find a link into the show notes of a TED-Ed animated video, and the video is titled The History of Marriage by Alex Gendler. It examines the history of marriage from ancient societies all the way to modern day, and I'd really recommend giving it a watch. It illustrates how prevalent polygamy was and is, and how rare monogamy has been as the status quo in historical societies. Many religious texts divinely sanction or command polygamy in certain instances. The Rig Veda, that was compiled as part of the Hindu canon sometime between 1700 and 1100 BCE, includes a few passages relating to polygamy. It sanctions the practice of polygamy for one man of multiple women of lower castes, provided that his first wife was from his caste. Typically only reserved for the elites in society, as women were and are seen as property, men of lower castes marrying multiple women of even lower castes is usually only practiced when the first wife is unable to bear children, and it's often only limited to one extra wife. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation on this because I am not a practicing Hindu and I do not know how to pronounce these Hindu words. So bear with me, I apologize in advance. This is from the Rig Veda. Quote, according to Vishnu Smriti, the number of wives is linked to the caste system. Now a Brahmana may take 4 wives in the direct order of the 4 castes. A Kshatriya, 3, a Vaishya, 2, a Shudra, only 1. This linkage of the number of permitted wives to the caste system is also supported by Buddhayana Dharma Sutra and Paraskara Girha Sutra. The Apastamba Dharma Sutra and Manusmriti allow a second wife if the first one is unable to discharge her religious duties or is unable to bear a son. End quote. In 1955, the Parliament of India enacted the Hindu Marriage Act, which made polygamy illegal for Hindus living in India. That's right, 1955. The Rig Veda was probably compiled more than 3,000 to 3,500 years before this law was passed in India. Here's a little snapshot of the text from this act. Quote, this act applies, A, to any person who is Hindu by religion in any of its forms or developments, including a Virashaiva or a Lingayat or a follower of Brahmo, Prathana, or Arya Samaj. B, to any person who is a Buddhist, Jain, or Sikh by religion, and C, to any person domiciled in the territories to which this act extends who is not a Muslim, Christian, Parsi, or Jew by religion, unless it is proved that any such person would not have been governed by the Hindu law or by any custom or usage as part of that law in respect to any of the matters dealt with herein if this act had not been passed. End quote. You'll find a link to that, the Hindu Marriage Act of 1955 in the show notes. Basically, this law said that any person not practicing Hinduism or Sikhism was not included in this polygamy restriction. So this act applies to anybody who is Buddhist, Hindu, Jain, or Sikh living in India. They are unable to practice polygamy, but it's still legal for every other religion in India. As for Buddhism, with a religion with so many adherents and spreading across such a vast swaths of geography, polygamy and how it's treated in Buddhist societies varies substantially. Most Buddhist areas tacitly approve of polygamy, but many of these cultures see it as a substandard form of marriage and consider any man who seeks a second wife to be on the decline in his first marriage, and possibly on the decline in society in general. With such a rich history of over 3,000 years spanning so many areas with billions of adherents, it's really hard to quantify the stance of Hinduism and Buddhism when it comes to polygamy, especially because what is approved of or disparaged in society is largely limited to geography. Two groups living in southwestern China could both be Buddhist, with one group practicing polygamy while the other forbade it. There's just no simple description either of these religions will fit into when it comes to monogamy versus polygamy. Once we dive into Judaism and cultures spanning through Near and Middle East all the way to the Western cultures, polygamy is largely enshrined in society as normative and has plenty of scriptural basis. This is from an article that I found titled Polygamy in Judaism. Quote, polygamy was such a well-established part of the social system that Mosaic law is not even critical of it. We find only certain regulations with respect to it, as, for example, if a man takes a second wife, the economic position of the first wife and of the children she bore must be secure, and, in the case of inheritance, no child of a subsequent marriage is to be preferred over a child from the first wife. Other regulations were that the high priest could have only one wife, and that a king in Israel should not have too many wives, citing Leviticus 21, Deuteronomy 17, and Exodus 21. The last injunction, however, was of no effect. David had 7 wives before he began to reign in Jerusalem, and an extraordinary number of wives and concubines has been attributed to Solomon. That's 2 Samuel 3, 14, and 5. In connection with David, the prophet Nathan did not denounce the king for adding Uriah's wife to those he already had, but only for the means he employed to make her free to marry him. That's 2 Samuel 12. However, if polygamy was not forbidden, it was also certainly not directly sanctioned. It is also a fact that it was most certainly not recommended. The Torah, in the story of the creation of the woman as a helpmate to man, with the operation of creating her out of the man's rib, only reinforces the concept. Quote, "And Adam said, 'This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh.'" End quote. That's Genesis 2. The ideal situation these verses of the Torah teach us are for a man and woman to become one unit. Polygamy was a socially accepted norm for the pre-Abrahamic past, and it was left undisturbed. As the civilization of the people reached a higher plateau, and, especially under the teaching of the prophets, the Jewish people's moral and religious consciousness developed. The polygamous marriage system gradually declined. This is noticeable in Israel after the return from the exile. In the Second Commonwealth, polygamy is far from general. Yet it survived far into the Christian era. In fact, if we study the New Testament as a Jewish source book, we must take note that Jesus, as a Jewish preacher of his era, neither condemns polygamous unions nor advocates a change in the system. From this non-interference attitude, Luther, as late as the 16th century, arrived at the conclusion that he could not forbid the taking of more than one wife. End quote. Like I said, you'll find a link to that entire blog entry on in the show notes. When it comes to theologians and religious authorities trotting out the arguments for and against polygamy in Abrahamic traditions specifically, there's no way to use the Torah or Bible to condemn polygamy. It just can't be done. We can look at the creation myth of the Abrahamic religions and see that Adam had only one wife and claim that that's how God wanted it to be, but that doesn't really do much for God's actual moral stance on polygamy, as many of his prophets had wives or concubines which are mentioned in the text itself. You don't even have to rely on assertions from other people living around these prophets and the preponderance of rumors and exposés to claim that Solomon had some level of relationship with 1,000 women. That's just included right in the religious text itself. One need look no further than Deuteronomy 25 to see how women are generally treated as property in Judaism, passed from husband to brother when the husband dies. Verse 5, quote, "If brethren dwell together and one of them die and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her, have sex with her, and take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of an husband's brother unto her. And it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth shall succeed in the name of his brother which is dead, that his name be not put out of Israel." End quote. Now, if you go back a couple of chapters to Deuteronomy 21, you'll find an interesting little tidbit about non-Israelite women being taken as spoils of war. Verse 10, quote, "When thou goest forth to war against thine enemies, and the Lord thy God hath delivered them into thine hands, and thou hast taken them captive, and seest among the captives a beautiful woman, and hast a desire unto her, that thou wouldest have her to thy wife, then thou shalt bring her home to thine house, and she shall shave her head and pare her nails. And she shall put the raiment of her captivity from off her, and shall remain in thine house, and bewail her father and mother a full month. And after that, thou shalt go in unto her, and be her husband, and she shall be thy wife." So, we'll get into it. One final addition, verse 14. "And it shall be, if thou have no delight in her, then thou shalt let her go whither she will, but thou shalt not sell her at all for money. Thou shalt not make merchandise of her, because thou hast humbled her." End quote. A lot to point out in that. First, a quick question. Are these warriors taking these female prisoners as wives only after they divorce their first wife so that they don't practice polygamy and, keep up with the morality sanctioned by the Adam and Eve creation myth? That's absurd. Warriors kept whatever they pillaged, including all of the women that they saw as beautiful, according to Deuteronomy. Second, if you think that Israelite warriors saw a beautiful woman among the captives and didn't rape her on the spot, you don't know how barbaric warfare works. Famously, in the sacking of Carthage, women threw themselves off of buildings to keep themselves from suffering the much worse fate of surviving the destruction of the city. It may have commanded these warriors in the Pentateuch to take women into their homes and let them mourn the loss of their parents and children and husband and pets and all of those things for an entire month before raping them, but I have a feeling like that part of the law wasn't so strictly adhered to. Third, if the warrior takes her for a wife and finds out that he doesn't like her, he can just let her go. A warrior couldn't sell her because he had stolen her worth from the next man who would purchase her. He can't make merchandise of her. He can't sell her as a slave sex worker because he humbled her, quote unquote. But he could just cast her away like a soiled sock and let her assimilate into society that was comprised of her enemies. What did that mean for her? She'd probably find work in a brothel for a few years before a short and painful death due to disease and abuse. Women living in any war-prone society were and still are dealt a tough hand. And please don't think these religious teachings have gone anywhere. We may be living in an enlightened society with the least global conflict the world has ever seen, but the human behaviors this commandment explicitly sanctions, they're a harsh everyday reality for women all over the world. Humans aren't past this phase as a species yet. As we read before in the passage about polygamy in Judaism, there isn't an explicit commandment from Jesus outlawing or sanctioning polygamy. The writings about Jesus' teachings strike plenty of Jewish roots, and Jesus harkens back to the Torah in a number of passages throughout the Gospels, but there's no explicit condemnation of polygamy. Some who disagree with polygamy will trot out Matthew 19, where Jesus cites Genesis and claims it says that a man and wife, not men and wives, but that passage is very explicit in what it's addressing. This is from Matthew 19, verse 3, quote, "Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?' Jesus replied, 'Haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore what God hath joined together, let no one separate.'" Verse 7, "Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery." The disciples said unto him, "If this is the situation between a husband and wife, is it better not to marry?" Jesus replied, "Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it." End quote. The point of this passage from Matthew was to discuss divorce, not polygamy. Jesus explicitly condemns divorce unless a woman has sex with another man, in which case it's all right. But there's a gaping loophole for polygyny, which allows for men to marry multiple wives and cleave unto all of them and become one flesh with every single one of them. I don't quite see the same loophole for polyandry because one woman marrying multiple men was probably seen as adulterous in society, so Jesus didn't explicitly define those terms, but one man with multiple women? That's totally cool, as long as he can provide for them. Once again, that gets to the point that usually polygamy was only reserved for the wealthiest in society who could actually sustain multiple wives, like King Solomon having 1,000 women. Once we get into the spread of Christianity, things become much more historically documentable, but also significantly more confusing. This is where the subject of polygamy and polyamory really ramps up. Emperor Constantine the Great basically established Christianity as the go-to religion in the Roman Empire. And thanks to the forgery of the donation of Constantine, the Pope was granted incredible powers in the secular realm for governance over the rapidly decaying Western Roman Empire. A theologian who gained some power shortly after Constantine's death, St. Augustine of Hippo, was viciously opposed to polygamy and divorce. His perspective slowly infected the Western societies under Catholic rule, and it became enshrined in the Catholic Catechism. St. Augustine wrote extensively on the sanctity of marriage, and what should and should not be approved by the Church and the societies under its rule. In his work, finished around 401 CE, titled On the Good of Marriage, we find passages like this. From chapter 7, quote, "But I see not how the man can have permission to marry another, in case he have left an adulteress, when a woman has not to be married to another, in case she have left an adulterer. And this being the case, so strong is that bond of fellowship in married persons that, although it be tied for the sake of begetting children, not even for the sake of begetting children is it loosed. For it is in the man's power to put away a wife that is barren, and marry one to whom to have children, and yet it is not allowed, and now indeed in our times, and after the usage of Rome, neither to marry in addition, so as to have more than one wife living. And surely, in case of an adulteress or adulterer being left, it would be possible that more men should be born, if either the woman were married to another, or the man should marry another." So that was chapter 7. In what it's referring to specifically is saying that divorce is unacceptable, polygamy is unacceptable, but serial monogamy is acceptable. And serial monogamy means just one man marrying a woman. She dies, marries the next woman. She dies, marries the next woman, and has kids from all of them. They're all able to raise up seed, and it's okay if he marries multiple women in that way, and polygamously. But it's known as serial monogamy because at no point is it okay for one man to have multiple living wives at any given time. This is from chapter 17 of On the Good of Marriage. Quote, "Clearly with the good will of the wife to take another woman, that from her may be born sons common to both, by the sexual intercourse and seed of the one, but by the right and power of the other, was lawful among the ancient fathers. Whether it be lawful now also, I would not hastily pronounce. For there is not now necessity of begetting children as there then was, when, even when wives bare children, it was allowed, in order to a more numerous posterity, to marry other wives in addition, which now is certainly not lawful." End quote. So what that's referring to is like with Abraham and Sarah. Abraham was trying to have children with Sarah, and she was barren. So with Sarah's blessing, he married his slave, Hagar, polygamously. She bore him a child, and then after that, Sarah was able to bear him a child as well. So that's what St. Augustine is discussing here, is having polygamous relations just for the sake of bearing children, which he says that it's not a necessity to beget children now because, well, there were a lot of people living in the Roman Empire. So he says it was allowed back then, but now it's not. It's certainly not lawful. One thing to point out here, there was a group that St. Augustine mentioned by name, and they were known as the Adamites, or the Adamians. They cropped up in northern Africa and practiced a form of early proto-Christianity, wherein they claimed to have regained Adam's primeval innocence. And most of what we know about this sect was written by early Catholic historiographers, and they present a culture of utter lawlessness. But the best we can tell, the Adamites practiced free love, they rejected the institution of marriage altogether, and while they communed with God, they did so in holy nudism, and they held all property in common. They were communalists, Proto-hippies. Proto-Christian proto-hippies. By the early 400s, the early Catholic Church had utterly smashed this little outcropping of Adamic hippies, and they were essentially lost to history for nearly a millennium, with some evidence that they had very brief revivals at various points leading up to the major restoration in the 13th century in the Netherlands, under the name of the Brethren of the Free Spirit and the Taborites in Bohemia, as well as the Beggards in Germany. And that all happened right before the Protestant Reformation. And it seems like every time these little free love sparks would strike some kindling, the fires of passion were quickly snuffed out by the Catholic authorities in the area. A formula which would strike a familiar tone throughout every society controlled by Catholic authoritarianism. As Christianity spread under the umbrella of Catholicism, more and more societies which were previously polygamous began converting to monogamy as the status quo, with polygamy being practiced as an exception to the rule, instead of it being general practice. As more generations were born into societies where polygamy was slowly being phased out, monogamy began to gain a significant foothold in Western cultures throughout all of what we call the Dark Ages, or the medieval period of European history. And we're going to spare deconstructing marriage cultures throughout this time because it covers so many disparate times and geographies separating so many different cultures, most of which were absorbed into the Roman Catholic Empire, which was staunchly opposed to polygamy in most areas at most times. But these free-love Christian groups would heavily influence the Christians of the Moravian Church. That was known as the Unitas Fraterum, the Unity of Brethren. The Wesley brothers would come into contact with a German Moravian named Peter Böhler around 1736 and would subsequently have incredible spiritual experiences in these tavern meetings and at gatherings on the Oxford campus. They came to be known as the Holy Club. The Wesley brothers would create their own religion in the wake of the Holy Club disbanding, which came to be known as Methodism. Methodism would slowly spread to Americas in the 1760s, which had profound Protestant impacts on the burgeoning populations in the colonies. So that was a fast forward to what we'll discuss in the Protestant Reformation, but before getting ahead of ourselves, we need to discuss polygamy in a culture and belief system which has historically been very friendly to polygamy. Islam. Islam, like every other religion, is a product of its time and the society from whence it arose. The founding prophet of Islam, Muhammad, was a rampant polygamist, and we can learn some interesting things about ancient Islamic culture through viewing the circumstances surrounding his multiple marriages. For starters, the Quran permits and even tacitly commands Muslims to practice polygamy. In Surah 4, titled An-Nisa, that's known as the Women's Surah, named after one of the Prophet's wives, we find passages such as this relating to what Allah sees as legitimate marriage. And I'm reading this from the Sahih International Translation. You'll find a link to Surah 4 in the show notes. Beginning with verse 3, quote, "And if you fear that you will not deal justly with the orphan girls, then marry those that please you of other women, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you fear that you will not be just, then marry only one or those your right hand possesses. And that is more suitable that you may not incline to injustice." Now verse 25. "And whoever among you cannot find the means to marry free, believing women, then he may marry from those whom your right hand possesses of believing slave girls. And Allah is most knowing about your faith. You believers are of one another, so marry them with the permission of their people and give them their due compensation according to what is acceptable." So you can marry slave, believing women. Verse 34. This is possibly the most abhorrent and disgusting verse out of this entire chapter. "Men are in charge of women by right of what Allah has given one over the other and what they spend for maintenance from their wealth. So righteous women are devoutly obedient, guarding in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them. Then if they persist, forsake them in bed. And finally, strike them. But if they obey you once more, seek no means against them. Indeed, Allah is forever exalted and grand." Yeah, so first, if your wife disobeys you, first, advise them. Second, forsake them in bed. Oh no, don't have sex with them. And finally, if they still disobey you, then it's okay to hit them. But if they obey, then, Allah is good. Verse 129, "And you will never be able to be equal in feeling between wives, even if you should strive to do so. So do not incline completely toward one and leave another hanging. And if you amend your affairs and fear Allah, then indeed Allah is ever forgiving and merciful." End quote. Now, I found a very interesting article about polygamy in Islam hosted on alislam.org, and I'll simply quote from it to discuss a moderate and nuanced stance on polygamy. Quote, "Based on such verses, certain Muslim governments, like Iran and Egypt, regulate the provision of polygyny. The person who intends to marry a second wife has to seek approval from the family court and prove the need for a second wife and the ability of providing for both in an adequate manner. Islam is a practical religion. Its laws are in line with human nature. It does not deny the natural forces in humans, rather it confronts them and provides guidance to control them without disrupting the peace in society. Almost all Western governments have forbidden polygamy, but adultery is most rampant in these very countries. In spite of all attempts to promote monogamous relationships, many married men have mistresses or are involved in extramarital affairs, resulting in higher divorce rates, broken families, and children growing up without fathers. And such kind of behavior has also touched the highest offices, religious as well as secular, of the United States of America. If a man wants to fool around, Islam will hold him responsible and tie him down to duties towards that second wife and her children. Ira Lurvey of the Family Law section of the American Bar Association said, quote, "We are going from monogamy to something called serial monogamy, and we have no rules and guidelines. We are groping in the dark for how to conduct our lives." End quote. Back to the article. Well, in Islam, you do not need to grope in the dark. Islam has given clear guidelines on all kinds of relationships, monogamy to polygamy. End quote. Of course, it's well known that Muhammad took multiple wives, and each of his 10 wives are explained in this same article. It lists that Muhammad remained unmarried for the first 25 years of his life. Then from 25 to 50, he had his first wife, Khadijah. But once he hits 50, he marries 10 more wives in 13 years. Now, that being said, there's no way to know of Muhammad's other relations beyond these wives, as warlords like Muhammad were often wont to have sex with many women without marrying them. And there's also no way to know just how many women he raped in his many military conquests. Muslim apologists will claim that Muhammad only had relations with the women that he married, as all good prophets do, but there is simply no evidence to substantiate such an astonishing claim. Muhammad was a wealthy man and took the spoils of war to add to his many possessions, including women as spoils of war. Women were property. And really, in many cultures, women still are property. People will also claim that his youngest wife, Lady Aisha, was merely 9 years old when he married her, but he waited until she was of age to actually have sex with her. Now, there is a hot dispute in Muslim circles about her actual age at the time of the marriage, and I don't know if there's any way to truly substantiate whether or not she was actually 9 years old when he married her. However, the article from which I'm taking a lot of this polygamy in Islam information puts her age at 18 when they were married. I don't know if there's any way to substantiate or refute that, but it is clearly written by an Islam apologist who is uncomfortable with the founding prophet of Islam being a pedophile. Needless to say, the majority of Muhammad's subsequent marriages were done for political purposes, to make peace or business transactions with other tribes. Others, like Lady Habiba, were taken in as Muhammad's wife because their families were opposed to Islam, and these wives were loyal to the Prophet, which justified that marriage. Another wife, Lady Safiya, was taken as a prisoner after the Battle of Khaybar, and was joined to Muhammad as a wife. Yep, thus keeping in line with the Abrahamic tradition of taking women as property from the spoils of war. It wouldn't be until the 20th century when largely Muslim countries would begin to outlaw or restrict polygyny. This next extract is from the Polygyny in Islam Wikipedia page, and much of it is taken from Sambul Ali Karamali in her 2008 article, The Muslim Next Door. Quote, "Countries that ban polygyny. Turkey was the first Muslim country to legally ban polygyny in 1926. This decision was not based on religious reasons, but rather was an entirely secular ban. Tunisia was the next country to ban polygyny through legislation passed in 1956 and restated in 1964. Unlike Turkey, Tunisia banned polygyny on religious grounds, citing two main reasons. First, the Quran limited the practice of polygyny, thus it did not support the practice and clearly intended for the practice to be eliminated over time. Second, the Quran demands equal treatment of all wives in a polygynous marriage, which is impossible, thus making the practice illegal. Finally, Israel banned polygyny as well by 1978. Countries that restrict polygyny. The following countries restrict the practice of polygyny. And there are dates next to a few of these countries, but not all of them. And the dates that are next to them are when they actually outlawed or restricted it. Egypt in 1920, Sudan 1929, India 1939, Algeria, Jordan 1951, Syria 1953, Morocco 1958, Bangladesh, Iraq 1959, Iran 67 and 75, Kuwait, and Lebanon. Some countries, including India, Iran, Iraq, Bangladesh, Algeria, Lebanon, Morocco, Jordan, and Kuwait, allow women to include a clause prohibiting polygyny in marriage contracts. Other countries, such as Iran and Pakistan, require that a man get permission to take a second wife from his first wife, and then show the court proof of his first wife's consent. Finally, countries such as Malaysia state that a man must get permission from both his wife and from the governmental religious authority in order to take a second wife. Although many countries have laws restricting or banning polygyny, it is still practiced illegally. It is difficult to enforce anti-polygyny laws and restrictions in countries with large rural populations. Furthermore, illegal polygyny often occurs in countries with poor social services, as women rely on husbands to support them in these situations." End quote. It's worth noting that these restrictions were put in place for a reason, because polygamy, or polygyny, was the status quo. Really, if there's one central point to take away from everything we're discussing in this episode, it's that polygamy used to be far more prevalent than it is today. Polygamy was the de facto societal norm. Monogamy is the new kid on the block, historically speaking. It's tough to attribute the 20th century attack on polygamy to one thing, but if I were to sit back and try and analyze this, I might attribute a bit of it to the influx of globalization with the advent of air travel. I mean, just sit back and think about this with me. Prior to the 20th century, it was hard to know what society was like on the other side of the globe. And that made it a challenge to impose one society's morals on another if they weren't geographically adjacent. Once people were able to quickly travel the world and mingle with people in other societies through air travel, it became much easier to understand differences in society and push societal changes one way or another. Now, at the risk of sounding conspiratorial, one thing worth pointing out is the kind of people who were first able to travel over air. The wealthy in Western societies, which were largely dominated by Christian ideals of monogamy being the superior family structure. Once wealthy Christians could travel to new worlds and quickly mingle with the wealthy elites of other societies, it's understandable that a healthy exchange of ideas would occur in just casual conversation. I'll spare using names in lieu of creating a purely hypothetical situation, but picture this if you will, and please suspend writing this off as a conspiracy theory rationale, and therefore invalid. A wealthy monogamous Christian hops on a plane in the 1950s and travels to third world Iraq or Bangladesh or fill in the blank of whatever largely Muslim country where polygyny was the status quo for the wealthiest in that society. This Christian meets with other affluent individuals in the society worlds apart from the Western society that they left, and they see polygyny in practice. In response to seeing this polygamy, which they see polygamy in general to be anathema to God's will, they either speak up about it and share their ideas of the superiority of monogamy with the other people that they're mingling with, or they return home to their Western society and report on what they saw. Their other monogamous Christian friends now know that other societies are practicing what they see as an abomination, and they all work together to take action to push legal restrictions on marriage practices in these other countries. It sounds conspiratorial when we try and ascribe malice to the wealthy Christians who can afford the air travel to proselyte to other societies, as opposed to the people who are less affluent who can't afford it at the time. But if we remove malice and view it merely as spreading ideas that these people consider to be righteous, it changes from being conspiratorial to being just logical and a proselyting campaign. And once you add up the millions of people able to quickly travel and the billions of small conversations that they've had with other affluent people over the past 100 years, one would be strained to claim that there's been no societal impact on a largely polygamous societies pushed forward by largely monogamous Christian societies. I would simply argue that the influx of regulations outlawing polygamy in cultures where it was viewed as standard practice or not immoral in the 20th and 21st centuries is the product of this massive Christian proselyting against polygamy on a worldwide scale. The point that I'm driving towards here is Christianity didn't reserve its fight against polygamy to the 20th century. Powerful versions of Christianity have been putting their thumb on the scale in favor of monogamy since the rise of Catholic political power. It just so happens once wealthy monogamous Christians could travel to third world countries that are practicing polygamy, we see an influx of the globalization of monogamy. When we view small societies practicing polygamy after the Protestant Reformation, we can see that one of the primary issues the Catholic Church has taken with these societies is their liberal stance on marriage. Prior to the Protestant Reformation, Catholicism had controlled who could and couldn't marry, as well as all divorce proceedings in the Western world. Our examination of polygamous societies now leads us to discussing a number of small, free-thinking Christian societies which cropped up out of the Protestant Reformation. Let's begin with the forefather of the Reformation, Martin Luther, or for the purists out there, Martin Luther. On the 13th of January, 1524, Martin Luther wrote a letter to Chancellor Gregory Bruck, and this letter has become the hallmark Lutheran stance on polygamy. The historical issue with this letter is it was given in reply to a petition asking Luther about the divinity of taking another wife when a man's first wife was unable to bear children unto him. To put this letter exchange into context, essentially, a certain man's wife couldn't have sex with him because of some unknown illness, and Luther's colleague, Karlstadt, gave broad license to the man to practice bigamy for the purpose of bearing children. Luther weighed in with his scriptural analysis, and this is the letter that has become Luther's stance on polygamy. Quote, I, for my part, admit I can raise no objection if a man wishes to take several wives, since Holy Scripture does not forbid this. But I should not like to see this example introduced among Christians. It does not beseem Christians to seize greedily and for their own advantage on everything to which their freedom gives them a right. No Christian surely is so God-forsaken as not to be able to practice continence when his partner, owing to the divine dispensation, proves unfit for matrimony. Still, we may well let things take their course. End quote. Now, that is something that was written in German, because Martin Luther was a German Augustinian friar. However, an alternate translation of the letter sheds a bit more light on Luther's stance. You can find an article in the show notes that discusses the historical context for this letter exchange, as well as a number of Luther's other quotes, wherein he tacitly approves of but disagrees with the utility of polygamy. Here's the alternate translation. Quote, the prince ought to ask the bigamist, have you obeyed your conscience directed by God's word? If he replies, it is by Karlstadt or by some other, the prince has nothing more to object, for he has no right to disquiet or hush the inward voice of that man, or decide in a matter entirely within the jurisdiction of him who, according to Zacharias, is commissioned to explain the divine law. For my part, I confess that I do not see how I can prevent polygamy. There is not in the sacred text the least word against those who would take several wives at one time, but there are many things permissible that ought not becomingly to be done. Of these is bigamy. End quote. Martin Luther was but one example of theologians leading into the Enlightenment with softened stances on marriage and polygamy. He was a Bible scholar. He had to be in order to translate the first people's Bible not controlled by the Catholic Church. So he knew the Bible through and through, and he was right when he said that Holy Scripture does not forbid polygamy. It seems as if he understood the implications of polygamy and how society treated women in polygynous relationships. So the alternate translation when he said, but there are many things permissible that ought not becomingly to be done, meaning bigamy or polygamy, that was a nuanced perspective given the society he was living in. That being said, I have to point out the world from whence the Protestant Reformation rose. Europe was dominated by Catholicism, which was strictly monogamous. To say that this cultural bias didn't factor into Luther's nuanced perspective would be arbitrary and fallacious. Everything Luther wrote was in response to society under Catholic control. Before the Reformation, he was an Augustinian friar, and we know St. Augustine's stance on marriage was nothing but vitriol against polygamy. Luther couldn't find any scriptural reference condemning polygamy, but his society all around him was strictly monogamous, so he would be hard-pressed to see a successful society which did practice polygamy. We have to parse out these biases from what Luther wrote. In the heat of the Protestant Reformation, a mere 300 kilometers from Luther's birth and death place, came the Munster Rebellion. The Munster Rebellion came in opposition to the recently emplaced Lutheran magistrates who governed the city of Westphalia. Bernard Rothman and Bernard Knipperdolling published anti-Catholicism pamphlets that were seen as radical even by Lutheran standards, which called for communalism and redistribution of wealth. One of the chief ways the leadership of the Munster Rebellion gained female followers was due to their proselyting tactics. They would actively seek out Catholic convents and nunneries, preaching free love and communalism to them, appealing to their carnal natures of sex drive and resource hunger, and these people would convert to the radical new form of Protestantism and move to Munster to live among the others in this rebel cause. After the initial siege of the city in April 1534, Jan Matthias, the leader of the cause, was killed, beheaded, and his genitals were reportedly nailed to the city gate. His successor, Jan van Leyden, claimed to receive a revelation from God which deemed him the rightful successor to the rebel cause, and he quickly instated the widespread practice of polygamy. Some reports claim that there were as much as 3 times as many women as men in Munster at the time. I don't know if there's any way to substantiate that claim, as it seems to be a frequent justification for polygamy regardless of truth in multiple societies, but Jan van Leyden subsequently took 16 wives for himself. In spite of their claims of fairness and communal property, it was primarily just the religious elites in Munster who were able to practice polygamy, because they had the resources necessary to sustain multiple marriages. In the summer of 1535, the city finally fell to the Catholic siege, and Jan van Leyden and the 2 Bernards were executed, but not before they were hoisted up in small cages for the whole city to see in the steeple of St. Lambert's Church. Those cages are still hanging in that steeple to this day. The Catholic opposition to the Munster Rebellion shouldn't be ascribed to polygamy alone. The leaders of the rebellion were heavily reliant on personal revelation based on biblical principles, which inevitably amounts to a decline in power and influence by the largest institution, which claimed to be God's emissaries already. You know, when a pope claims to speak for God, and another group of people come along saying that they speak for God as well, that's a threat to the overpowering Catholic power dynamic, which was already threatened with the rise of the Protestant Reformation, which was in its infancy at this time. The Munster Rebellion sparked a fire set to consume Catholic control over the rest of Europe as the Enlightenment slowly gained a foothold. In a world decreasingly controlled by Catholic religious dicta, free thinking and philosophy could flourish with only marginal limitation. John Dee was one of the Enlightenment's greatest philologists and students of a wide plethora of schools of study. Once he graduated from Cambridge in 1546, John Dee began a tireless study of everything from mathematics and astrology to botany and alchemy. He served as personal advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, who had been imprisoned for being a supporter of Protestantism and the Protestant rebel cause. John Dee purportedly had the largest library of any institution in England and was known as one of the smartest people alive in his day. He would spend hours upon hours investigating practical as well as spiritual alchemy and many other occult practices. And finally, in 1582, John Dee teamed up with a man by the name of Edward Kelly, and they both began frequent bouts of drug-induced spiritual pursuits of knowledge. Edward Kelly was adept in the use of seer stones to hunt for buried treasure, and Kelly also had a terrible reputation as a counterfeiter. Throughout these various seances, Edward Kelly was known as John Dee's personal prophet or seer, and they spent much of their time attempting to translate the Enochian language, which was channeled through Kelly. Modernly, we would call this a drug-induced glossolalia, to which Dee was trying to translate into English or Latin. During one of these seances, Edward Kelly gave John Dee a divine revelation that they should share all of their possessions in common, including their wives. This had a few profound impacts. Dee was rather wealthy. Not really in liquid cash, but in possessions. His library was full of valuable books and trinkets acquired from all over the world. Dee also had a nice 23-year-old wife. She bore a son, thought to be Edward Kelly's, conceived during their wife-swapping rituals, which John Dee raised as his own child. Edward Kelly and John Dee parted ways soon after the son's birth. The reason that Edward Kelly and John Dee are relevant is Dee was basically the foremost scholar on occult practices and the Enochian language, which Joseph Smith would emulate in his own way. These people and other students of similar philosophies Joseph likely revered for their research into alchemy and occultism. When your heroes practice wife-swapping and free love and polygamy, it's hard not to see it as acceptable or even divinely inspired, regardless of the need to keep it underground because monogamy had become the only legally sanctioned form of marriage. And really, monogamy has become the status quo throughout the Western world over the past 1800 years. But it hasn't been without its detractors. Free love, wife-swapping, nudist, polygamist, all of these kinds of communities have existed in small samples, seemingly erupting spontaneously out of inhospitable world dominated by a single genre of religion which would prefer to see monogamy flourish, and which would go to great lengths to suppress or silence these small groups championing polygamy, polyamory, and free love. With the advent of the printing press and these communities cropping up everywhere throughout Europe and America, the previous stranglehold that the Catholic Church and other Orthodox Protestant Christian sects had on monogamy and their ability to suppress these groups quickly waned. With the increased prevalence of the Enlightenment infecting societies, feminist and free love writers and poets like William Blake emerged, repeatedly condemning marriage as a form of slavery. What is the most moral form of marriage? The answer to that question seems wholly dependent on the specific religious belief of a specific demographic. So, there may be no actual answer. There was a study recently published in the March 2011 Journal of Evolution and Human Behavior, which examined the utility of polygamy versus monogamy, specifically assessing which form of marriage is more successful in raising offspring. That's always been a go-to argument for justifying polygamy, to raise up seed unto this generation. So this study took a hard look at the data and the findings, and what they found is quite interesting. But it's not surprising when you think about it for a minute. I'm just going to read a couple of extracts from an article that covered the study, and this was an article published on livescience.com. You'll find a link to it in the show notes. And by the way, the show notes this week are brimming with articles and links and a ton of information to dive way deeper down the polygamy rabbit hole. If you want to look into these things and read the sources that I used in order to compose this, please check that out. You will you'll get lost down this same rabbit hole, and your mind will be repeatedly blown like mine has been for the past few weeks in compiling the research for this. So, to the article from livescience.com, quote, "Mormons make an excellent test case for evolutionary biologists for two reasons," Wade said. "First, they keep precise genealogical records. Second, Mormons are a rare example of a group of people who changed their mating practices. In 1862, Congress made polygamy illegal in U.S. territories, including the Mormon stronghold of Utah. In 1890, the Mormon Church issued a declaration ending the practice. Of married Utah men born in 1833, almost 18% had multiple wives. Wade and his colleagues estimate. By a few decades later, less than 1% of married men were in polygamous relationships. Here, with this single population, there's a change, an externally driven change, in the system of mating from polygamous to monogamous," Wade said. "And even better, nothing else changes. They don't change their lifestyle, they don't change what they eat or where they live. The researchers decided to find out how the change affected the evolutionary pressures on Mormon men and women, particularly sexual selection, in which there is competition between males or females to win a mate. It's this pressure that explains a male peacock's glitzy tail. Polygamy exacerbates such sexual selection. After all, for every man with 5 wives, there are 4 with no wives at all. Thus, the multiple wife system separates men into those with huge amounts of offspring and those with no children at all. Now, quoting from later in the article, unsurprisingly, the men who acquired lots of wives also produced more children. For each additional spouse, a man could expect about 6 more kids. Each wife in the relationship could expect to produce an average of 1 fewer child for every additional wife. When polygamy was outlawed, the reproductive gap between successful polygamous men and wifeless singletons plummeted by 58%, the researchers found. If you have only one partner, the maximum number of offspring for the male is going to be the same as the maximum for the females, Wade said, so the end of polygamy brought the genders into line. The variation from one male to the next with monogamy becomes almost equal to the variation from one woman to the next with monogamy. End quote. So this study seemed to point out that monogamy is more successful at raising more children. And really, that's an unsurprising finding in my opinion. If you have one man who's supporting 10 wives and 30 children, chances are they're going to be less successful than 10 women supporting 10 wives with 3 children each. With the second model, that makes it much more possible for each family to raise more than 3 children. It also widens the sample of genes included in the community gene pool, which also increases the likelihood of reproductive success. If we hearken to what the Abrahamic religions claim as moral, which means, raising more offspring as being the more moral thing, then monogamy is the more moral system of marriage. However, considering the vast overpopulation of the planet already, I would argue that raising more children in a world with millions or possibly billions of people being starved for resources is an incredibly immoral thing to do, which means that polygamy is more moral as a form of marriage when you only consider the single metric of the number of offspring. But there are so many ways to cut marriage and morality. Today we've only taken a look at what is and has been, not what ought to be. Because I don't think that there's a solid and concise answer to that great question. What is the most moral form of marriage? It's a challenge to try and judge what is best for marriage, because every society treats marriage and family differently. So, to wrap things up for us today, I hope you'll permit me a reading of William Blake's Visions of the Daughters of Albion. As I stated before, William Blake was a free love feminist who considered marriage an abomination, a form of slavery. This is poetry. Interpret it how you will. The Argument. I loved Theotormin, and I was not ashamed. I trembled in my virgin fears, and I hid in Lutha's veil. I plucked Lutha's flower, and I rose up from the veil, but the terrible thunders tore my virgin mantle in twain. Visions. Enslaved the daughters of Albion weep, a trembling lamentation, upon their mountains, in their valleys, sigh towards America. For the soft soul of America, Uthun wandered in woe, along the vales of Lutha, seeking flowers to comfort her, and thus she spoke to the bright marigold of Lutha's vale. Art thou a flower? Art thou a nymph? I see thee now a flower, now a nymph. I dare not pluck thee from thy dewy bed. The golden nymph replied, Pluck thou my flower, Uthun, the mild. Another flower shall spring, because the soul of sweet delight can never pass away. She ceased and closed her golden shrine. Then Uthun plucked the flower, saying, I pluck thee from thy bed, sweet flower, and put thee here to glow between my breasts. And thus I turned to where my soul seeks. Over the wave she went in winged exalted swift delight, and over Theotormin's reign took her impetuous course. Bromion rent her with his thunders. On his stormy bed lay the faint maid, and soon her woes appalled his thunders hoarse. Bromion spoke, Behold this harlot here on Bromion's bed. and let the jealous dolphins sport around the lovely maid. Thy soft American plains are mine, and mine thy north and south. Stamped with my signet are the swarthy children of the sun. They are obedient, they resist not, they obey the scourge. Their daughters worship terrors and obey the violent. Now thou mayst marry Bromian's harlot, and protect the child of Bromian's rage, that Uthun shall put forth in 9 moons' time. Then storms rent Theotormyn's limbs, he rolled his waves around, and folded his black, jealous waters round the adulterate pair, bound back to back in Bromian's cave, terrors and meekness dwell. At entrance, Theotormyn sits wearing the threshold hard, with secret tears beneath him sound like waves on a desert shore. The voice of slaves beneath the sun, and children bought with money, that shiver in religious caves beneath the burning fours of lust that belch incessant from the summits of the earth. Uthun weeps not, she cannot weep, her tears are locked up, but she can howl incessant, writhing her soft, snowy limbs, and calling Theotormyn's eagles to prey upon her flesh. I call with holy voice, kings of the sounding air, rend away this defiled bosom that I may reflect the image of Theotormyn on my pure, transparent breast. The eagles at her call descend and rend their bleeding prey. Theotormyn severely smiles. Her soul reflects that smile as the clear spring muddled with feet of beasts grows pure and smiles. The daughters of Albion hear her woes and echo back her sighs. Why does Theotormyn sit weeping upon the threshold, and Uthun hovers by his side, persuading him in vain? I cry, "Arise, O Theotormyn, for the village dog barks at the breaking day. The nightingale has done lamenting. The lark does rustle in the ripe corn, and the eagle returns from nightly prey, and lifts his golden beak to the pure east. Shaking the dust from his immortal points to awake the sun that sleeps too long. Arise, my Theotormyn, I am pure, because the night is gone, that closed me in its deadly black." They told me that the night and day were all I could see. They told me I had 5 senses to enclose me up, and they enclosed my infinite brain into a narrow circle, and sunk my heart into the abyss, a red round globe, hot, burning, till all from life I was obliterated and erased. Instead of morn arises a bright shadow, like an eye in the eastern cloud. Instead of a night, a sickly charnel horse, that Theotormyn hears me not. To him the night and morn are both alike. A night of sighs, a morning of fresh tears, and none but Bromian can hear my lamentations. With what sense is it that the chicken shuns the ravenous hawk? With what sense does the tame pigeon measure out the expanse? With what sense does the bee form cells? Have not the mouse and frog eyes and ears and sense of touch? Yet are their habitations and their pursuits as different as the forms of their joys. Ask the wild ass why he refuses burdens, and the meek camel why he loves man. Is it because of eye, ear, mouth, or skin, or breathing nostrils? No, for these the wolf and tiger have. Ask the blind worm the secrets of the grave, and why her spires love to curl round the bones of death. Ask the ravenous snake where she gets her poison, and the winged eagle why he loves the sun, and then tell me the thoughts of man which have been hid of old. Silent, I hover all the night, and all day could be silent. If Theotormyn once would return his loved eyes upon me, how can I be defiled when I reflect my image pure? Sweetest the fruit that the worms feed on, and the soul preyed on by woe, the new-washed lamb tinged with valley smoke, and bright swan by the earth of our immortal river. I bathe my wings, and I am white and pure to hover around Theotormyn's breast. Then Theotormyn broke his silence, and he answered, "Tell me what is the night or day to one overflowed with woe? Tell me what is a thought, of what substance is it made? Tell me what is a joy, and in what gardens do joys grow? And in what rivers swim the sorrows, and upon what mountains waves shadows of discontent? And in what houses dwell the wretched, drunken with the woe forgotten, and shut up from cold despair. Tell me where dwell the thoughts forgotten till thou call them forth. Tell me where dwell the joys of old, and where the ancient loves. And when will they renew again, and the night of oblivion past? That I might traverse times and spaces far remote, and bring comforts into a present sorrow and a night of pain. Where goest thou, O thought? To what remote land is thy flight? If thou returnest to the present moment of affliction, wilt thou bring comforts on thy wings, and dews and honeys and balm, or poison from the desert wilds, from the eyes of the envier? When Bromian said, and shook the cavern with his lamentation, Thou knowest that the ancient trees seen by thy eyes have fruit, but knowest thou that the trees and fruit flourished upon the earth to gratify senses unknown? Trees, beasts, and birds unknown, not unperceived, spread in the infinite microscope, in places yet unvisited by the voyager, and in worlds over another kind of seas, and in atmospheres unknown. Ah, there are other wars beside the wars of sword and fire, and there are other sorrows beside the sorrows of poverty, and there are other joys beside the joys of riches and ease. And is there not one law for both the lion and the ox? And is there not eternal fire and eternal change to bind the phantoms of existence from eternal life? Then Uthun waited, silent all the day and all the night. But when the morn arose, her lamentation renewed. The daughters of Albion hear her woes and echo back her sighs. O Urizen, creator of men, mistaken demon of heaven, thy joys are tears, thy labor vain to form men to thine image. How can one absorb another? Are not different joys? Holy, eternal, infinite, and each joy is a love? Does not the great mouth laugh at a gift, and the narrow eyelids mock at the labor that is above payment? And wilt thou take the ape for thy counselor, or the dog for a schoolmaster to thy children? Does he who contemns poverty, and he who turns with abhorrence from usury, feel the same passion, or are they moved alike? How can the giver of gifts experience the delights of the merchant? How the industrious citizen the pains of the husbandman? How different far the fat-fed hireling with hollow drum, who buys whole cornfields into wastes and sings upon the heath. How different their eye and ear, how different the world to them. With what sense does a parson claim the labor of the farmer? What are his nets and gins and traps, and how does he surround him with cold floods of abstraction and with forests of solitude, to build him castles and high spires where kings and priests may dwell, till she who burns with youth and knows no fixed lot is bound in spells of law to one she loathes, and must drag the chain of life in weary lust? Must chilling murderous thoughts obscure the clear heaven of her eternal spring, to bear the wintry rage of a harsh terror driven to madness, bound to hold a rod over her shrinking shoulders all the day, and all the night, to turn the wheel of false desire, and longings that wake her womb, to the abhorrent birth of cherubs in the human form, that live a pestilence and die a meteor and are no more. Till the child dwell with one he hates, and do all the deeds he loathes, and the impure scourge force his seed into its unripe birth, ere yet his eyelids can behold the arrows of the day. Does the whale worship at thy footsteps as the hungry dog, or does he scent the mountain prey? Because his nostrils wide draw in the ocean, does his eye discern the flying cloud as the raven's eye? Or does he measure the expanse like the vulture? Does the still spider view the cliffs where eagles hide their young? Or does the fly rejoice because the harvest is brought in? Does not the eagle scorn the earth and despise the treasures beneath? But the mole knoweth what is there, and the worm shall tell it thee. Does not the worm erect a pillar in the moldering churchyard, and a palace of eternity in the jaws of the hungry grave? Over his porch these words are written: Take thy bliss, O man, and sweet shall be thy taste, and sweet thy infant joys renew. Infancy, fearless, lustful, happy, nestling for delight, in lapse of pleasure, innocence, honest, open, seeking, the vigorous joys of morning light, open to virgin bliss. Who taught thee modesty, subtle modesty, child of night and sleep, when thou wakest? Wilt thou dissemble all thy secret joys, or wert thou not awake when all this mystery was disclosed? Then comest thou forth a modest virgin, knowing to dissemble, with nets found under thy night pillow to catch virgin joy, and brand it with the name of whore, and sell it in the night, in silence, even without a whisper, and in seeming sleep. Religious dreams and holy vespers, light thy smoky fires. Once were thy fires lighted by the eyes of honest morn, and does not my Theotormon seek this hypocrite modesty, this knowing, artful, secret, fearful, cautious, trembling hypocrite? Then is Uthun a whore indeed, and all the virgin joys of life are harlots, and Theotormon is a sick man's dream. And Uthun is the crafty slave of selfish holiness. But Uthun is not so, a virgin filled with virgin fantasies, open to joy and to delight wherever beauty appears. If in the morning sun I find it, there my eyes are fixed, in happy copulation. If in the evening mild, wearied with work, sit on a bank and draw the pleasures of this free-born joy. The moment of desire, the moment of desire! The virgin that pines for man shall awaken her womb to enormous joys in the secret shadows of her chamber. The youth shuts up from the lustful joy shall forget to generate, and create an amorous image in the shadows of his curtains and the folds of his silent pillow. Are not these the places of religion, the reward of continence? The self-enjoyings of self-denial? Why dost thou seek religion? Is it because acts are not lovely that thou seekest solitude, where the horrible darkness is impressed with reflections of desire? Father of jealousy, be thou accursed from the earth! Why hast thou taught my Theotormon this accursed thing? Till beauty fades from off my shoulders, darken and cast out, a solitary shadow wailing on the margin of non-entity. I cry, love, 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 happy, happy love, free as the mountain wind. Can that be love, that drinks another as a sponge drinks water, that clouds with jealousy his nights, with weepings all the day, to spin a web of age around him, grey and hoary, dark, till his eyes sicken at the fruit that hangs before his sight? Such is self-love that envies all, a creeping skeleton, with lamp-like eyes watching around the frozen marriage bed. But silken nets and traps of adamant will Uthun spread, and catch for the girls of mild silver or of furious gold. I'll lie beside thee on a bank and view their wanton play, in lovely copulation, bliss on bliss with Theotormon. Red as rosy morning, lustful as the firstborn beam, Uthun shall view his dear delight, nor e'er with jealous cloud come in the heavens of generous love, nor selfish blightings bring. Does the sun walk in glorious raiment on the secret floor where the cold miser spreads his gold? Or does the bright cloud drop on his stone threshold? Does his eye behold the beam that brings expansion to the eye of pity, or will he bind himself beside the ox and thy hard furrow? Does not that mild beam blot the bat, the owl, the glowing tiger, and the king of night? The sea fowl takes the wintry blast for a covering to her limbs, and the wild snake, the pestilence to adorn him with gems and golds, and trees and birds and beasts and men, behold their eternal joy. Arise, you little glancing wings, and sing your infant joy. Arise and drink your bliss, for everything that lives is holy. Thus every morning wails Uthun, but Theotormon sits upon the margined ocean, conversing with shadows dire. The daughters of Albion hear her woes and echo back her sighs. The end. William Blake's Visions of the Daughters of Albion, 1793. thus marks the end of part 1 of our analysis of polygamy and polyamory and free love throughout written history leading up into Mormonism in the 19th century. It's been a long haul. Thank you so much for listening. One quick word before we shut it down tonight. On December 2nd through December 3rd, David Smalley is doing his annual broadcast-a-thon, and he's been nice enough to grant a Mormon hour beginning on December 3rd, Sunday at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. That is noon Eastern Time. And we are going to talk Mormon history and do our Mormon hour. This year's beneficiary for the fundraising campaign is Modest Needs Foundation, which is an organization that helps people coming out of religion, particularly with their modest needs. If somebody who has recently left religion needs to pay that pesky utility bill, or a teenager is kicked out of their parents' basement because they are no longer believing in the religion that their parents follow, Modest Needs steps in and takes care of those people. So I'm here announcing that I will be making a $500 donation match during the hour on December 3rd, beginning at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time once again. If you feel like it is an organization to which you would like to generously donate during this season of giving, please consider doing so and tuning in at that time to join in and match up to that $500 donation. I'll be preparing a small Mormon history segment, an essay to present to David Smalley and the listeners during that hour. I believe we are on the hour right before cognitive dissonance or something, so we are trying to compete with the heaviest hitters in the secular podcasting community. So I really hope to see you over there, and let's see if we can raise some money for this incredible organization. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for tuning in to David Smalley's 24-hour broadcast-a-thon. And also thank you so much to the people who keep this podcast going. Thank you to Julie for being the Facebook and Twitter social media guru for posting up in there. Thank you so much to Jason Camo for providing the music used in this show with his permission. Go to aloststateofmind.com to check out his music there. Thank you to Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres for providing legal counsel for this show, as well as the co-host of Opening Arguments. And thank you so much to all of the supporters on patreon.com/nakedmormonism for funding this research. Thank you most of all to all of the listeners out there for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2017, all rights reserved.